In this video, we're going to be looking at using the graph of a quadratic to determine its domain and range and where it's increasing and decreasing. So first, let's talk about domain and range. The domain of a function is all possible x values it can accept, and the range is all possible y values that it can output. So if we're looking at domain on a graph, we're going to be looking from left to right because we're going to be writing our answers in interval notation, which takes the smaller number first and then the larger number. So as we look at our first example, as we're looking from left to right, the first thing we see is this arrow. This tells us that our function goes on forever in the negative x direction. So our domain starts at negative infinity. Next, as we look from left to right, the very last thing we see is this arrow, which tells us that our graph continues on forever in the positive x direction. So that tells us that we go to infinity. So our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Let's look at our second example. We're going to do the same thing where we look from left to right. So the very first thing we see is this arrow. So again, our domain starts at negative infinity. And we continue on until we get to this arrow, which tells us we go forever in the positive x direction. So we go from negative infinity to positive infinity. Next, let's talk a little bit about range. Range is very similar, except for we're going to look from bottom to top because we're talking about y values now. So as we look at our first example, the very bottom thing we see of our graph is going to be at y equals 1. So our range starts at 1. And as we trace up, the very last thing we see are these arrows, telling us that we go off to positive infinity in the y direction. Let's look at our second example. Again, we're going to look from bottom to top on our graph, and the very first thing we're going to see this time are these arrows. This tells us that our graph is going on forever in the negative y direction, so our range starts at negative infinity. So as we trace up, the very top of our graph happens at y equals 1, telling us that our range is from negative infinity to positive 1. Next, let's talk a little bit about increasing and decreasing. Increasing and decreasing, we are going to look, again, left to right on our graph. So as we look from left to right, one easy way to tell whether we're increasing or decreasing is to draw arrows on our graph. If our arrow is pointing down, we're decreasing, and if our arrow is pointing up, we're increasing. One thing to note when you're working with quadratics is your direction is always going to change at your vertex. So let's look at this first example. As we're going from left to right, the very first thing we see is this arrow, telling us that we continue off into negative infinity in the x direction. One thing to note is when we're working with increasing and decreasing, we are always marking where we are increasing and decreasing with our x rather than marking how much we are increasing and decreasing. So we're always writing down the x values, not the y. So our very first thing we notice is negative infinity. And we can see that our arrows are pointing down as we go until we reach our vertex, which is at x equals negative 3. So that tells us that we're decreasing from negative infinity to negative 3. At negative 3, our direction changes, and we can see that our arrows start going up. So we're increasing. And we're increasing from -3 until the very last thing we see is this arrow, telling us that we're going off to positive infinity. So for our first example, we're decreasing from -infinity to -3, and then increasing from -3 to positive infinity. Let's take a look at our second example. Again, let's look from left to right, and let's draw our arrows. And what we see is that our arrows are going up until we reach our vertex, and then they start going down. So we're going to be increasing from -infinity to 2, and then we decrease from 2 to infinity.